growth, and as I recall, Mr. Shaughnessy, he had just described how the 3 or 2, if that's the case, metals come out with sort of as if there's a cone on the end of the gun.
Thank you, Judge.
You're welcome.
Again, sir, we've talked about 2 different types of things that come out of the firearm, right?
Yes.
One comes out, that's gunshot residue, and you have to be within about a foot of a firearm in order to get that deposited upon you.
We're talking about gunshot primer residue?
Gunshot primer residue.
Probably, from the size of the weapon, it's a good estimation.
More or less.
About a foot or so is probably, from the size of the weapon as well as the shooter's hand. In front of the weapon, it could be multiple feet for a primer.
Okay.
And if I may interrupt, if you answer this, I didn't hear it. What's in the primer? The same components?
Right. The primer contains the particles that will have the 3 elements or the 2 of the 3 elements. Whereas the other residue that's used for distance determination is just combusted gunpowder or unburned gunpowder.
Pardon my interruption.
One second.
By the way, then I misspoke. The 3 metals, or 2 if that's the case, they don't come out as if shot through a cone. It's the either burned gunpowder, partially burned, or unburned that comes out as if it's on a cone.
Right.
Through a cone.
That's the material that you can actually either see visibly or capture its image somehow by testing and get a pattern that you can then associate with the distance.
Pardon me.
Okay. So perhaps that's a better distinction. I should call it gunshot residue, the things in the particles, the burnt and unburnt that might go up to 5 feet, correct?
Right.
And I should call it gunshot primer residue, the things that would probably go 1 foot or so.
From the size of the weapon. The gunshot primer residue is the type of residue that would be useful in determining if a person fired a weapon or was in close proximity to the discharge of a weapon.
Okay. But I think as you corrected me, the better way to describe these, instead of me just saying the stuff that comes out of the front or the back or the openings, would be gunshot residue comes out of the front of the gun.
Yes.
It's composed of burnt and unburnt particles.
Correct.
And we've indicated that that can travel, again, depending upon the handgun and the ammunition, up to 5 feet before we lose it.
Right, is a generalization for handguns.
Might be 5 feet 3 inches, right?
Depending on the gun or the ammo, it could be
Might be 4 feet 8 inches.
right.
Okay, it's not going to be from 5 to 9 or 10.
Right. I would, in my opinion, I would expect to not see residue at 5 feet or greater in that range.
And in order to be in the presence of gunshot primer residue, though, you've got to be within a foot or so.
That's a bit more difficult to estimate distance because it's going to be formed around the weapon, and it's not going to have the same amount of energy that the material expelled from the end of the barrel is going to have. So it's either going to get on the shooter's hand or someone in close proximity to the shooter. But I'd give it a distance to say, like, within a foot or so. I can't really say that. It's got to be in close proximity.
If I'm shooting a firearm, on, obviously I'm within a foot or so of the firearm, correct?
Right.
Absolute contact with it, correct?
Yes.
Very likely I'm going to get gunshot primer residue.
On your hands, yes.
Okay. And anybody that was in very close proximity to me may get gunshot primer residue from what I fired.
Potentially, yes.
Okay. But from me to you, how far am I from you?
3 or 4 feet, maybe.
Okay. You wouldn't expect that I would get my gunshot primer residue. If I fire a gun right here, is it going to get on you?
Probably not, but certain environmental situations, wind or whatever, could blow it my way. But I probably at this distance wouldn't expect to find it, but not completely.
If I were to reach all the way over here and fire that same gun, then you would expect that you would get some gunshot primer residue upon you.
Yes.
When I say all the way over here, I'm leaning over the witness stand and my hand is actually over your clothing.
Right, maybe a foot away or so.
Okay. Would you expect to have it on your hand from right here, where your hands are?
Sure, maybe, yeah.
Now let's back up to everything that you tested. And I'll take it collectively with Ms. Williams and Mr. Wilson's clothes. You didn't find any gunshot residue on any of the articles that have been put on hangers over the last day or so?
That's correct.
No gunshot residue at all?
That's correct.
And obviously no gunshot primer residue?
I didn't test the clothes for gunshot primer residue.
But you found no gunshot residue?
Right. No residue that would be useful in determining a muzzle to target distance.
So if you found no gunshot residue, it would be indicative of two things. One is either the muzzle to target was in excess of 5 feet.
Right. Generally, it was far enough away that any residue produced from the discharge of the firearm couldn't reach the target.
Okay. So let me go slow. Two things. One is generally it's in excess of 5 feet because that's where the fall off happens.
Yeah. Yes, is the general number.
Or there was an intermediary source.
Correct.
Okay. So if there's a piece of glass between you and I'm within 3 feet, and I shoot, that glass is going to prevent the residue from going through.
Right, on the first shot it will.
Okay. And on a subsequent shot, would it then go through? If the glass is gone, it's going to go through, correct?
Right.
But each time it goes through an individual piece of glass, that's going to prevent the residue from following the projectile.
Right, the majority of the residue. Some could pass through the first hole, but it wouldn't be near as much as if the window was gone.
Okay. But again, just to be clear, there was no gunshot residue on any of the items of clothing that you tested.
Right.
So I know I've gone around and around. There's either an intermediary object or it's in excess of 5 feet.
Right, that would indicate that there's either an intermediate object between the firearm and the target, or it's a distant shot.
So while we know projectiles went in, they were either impaired by an intermediary object or they were in excess of 5 feet.
Right, a distant shot.
Okay. Now, for purposes of my next question, if Mr. Russell had gunshot primer residue on his hand, okay?
Okay.
If Mr. Russell had gunshot primer residue on his hand, that would be indicative of a fact that either A, he fired a weapon, correct?
Yes.
Or B, he was in such close proximity, such as you and I just demonstrated, within a foot or so of somebody else who had fired a weapon, correct?
Within close proximity, yes.
Okay. What's the farthest close proximity?
Difficult to say. I don't think I could ascribe a number to that. But it would be within a couple of feet, maybe. I mean, it's hard to say.
So if he has gunshot primer residue on his hand, okay, that means that either he fired a weapon or somebody was in very close proximity to him who did.
Those two, and there's also a C to that.
Okay?
That could be that the individual handled an object that had gunshot primer residue on it, and there was a secondary transfer from that object to the hands.
Okay, very good. So, for purposes of this question, and you did take gunshot primer residue samples from Mr. Russell.
I did.
You didn't test them, though?
I did not.
You sent them to BCI?
Yes.
Okay. So if BCI came back and said, Mr. Russell's hand has gunshot primer residue, we've got three options.
Correct.
One, he fired a gun.
Yes.
Okay. Sometime recent enough that he didn't lose the gunshot residue, correct?
Yes.
And you could wipe it off, right?
It can be removed easily, yes.
You wash your hands?
Sure.
Okay. So if he has gunshot primer residue on his hand, then either he fired a weapon and hadn't washed it off or rubbed it off, right?
Correct.
B, he was in such close proximity to somebody else who just fired a weapon, correct?
Yes.
Or C, he handled a weapon that had recently been fired and still had that gunshot primer residue.
A weapon or some other surface that had residue on it that was transferred secondarily.
But just to take you back, we know from your testing of the clothes that the shots that came into the car either blocked gunshot residue by an intermediary source or were at least 5 feet away, correct?
Right, based on the absence of residue and any patterns of residue on the clothing.
Okay. So we know, based upon your testing, that either the shots were from 5 feet or more away, and were they closer, an intermediary source stopped the transfer of residue from shots fired into the car onto the clothes.
Correct.
That's correct. So then, for purposes of my question, if Mr. Russell had gunshot residue, primer residue, on his hands, he either fired a weapon, had somebody in very close proximity to him fire a weapon, or handled a surface that had just had gunshot residue deposited upon it, correct?
Right, if there in fact are positive findings, then those are the 3 possibilities that would.
Well, for purposes of my questioning, I'm telling you, for purposes of this, that BCI found gunshot residue on his hand.
Okay.
Okay. So there's no indication from the point of an intermediary source stopping the residue on the way in the car, or the distance that any weapon was fired within 5 feet of him into the car, right?
Yes, based on the fact that there is an intermediate object and the fact that there's no residue in terms of patterns of residue on the victim's clothing.
Right. So it would appear from your testing and our scientific principles that the shots that went into the car were either in excess of 5 feet or had an intermediary source that prevented the gunshot residue from depositing on the clothes, right?
Yes, but the only problem with that is once that intermediate object is compromised, then there is the possibility that you could then get residue, even in the form of primer residue, transferred beyond that intermediate object once it was compromised, and once there's holes in it.
Well, let's talk about that. If it's compromised, then gunshot, say I compromise the window, I shoot the whole window out, right? Now there is no window, right? Now we're dealing as if it's just me and you, right?
Yes.
There's no intermediate source, right?
Correct.
So then all the prior principles that you applied come back. I have to be within 5 feet to get residue on you, right?
At least, and then closer to in order to get a pattern.
Okay. And you found no residue, let alone a pattern, right?
Correct.
Okay. And in order to get the gunshot primer residue, I've got to be even closer, right?
To the sides of the weapon, one thing we should keep in mind is that expelled from the end of the barrel of the weapon is going to be primer residue as well, and that's going to travel. It's going to have more energy behind it than the sides of the weapon.
All right. So, if Mr. Russell has gunshot primer residue on his hands, but there's no other gunshot residue, such as comes out of the muzzle of the target, okay? That's the question we're left with, or that's the situation we're left with, okay?
Okay.
Okay. And that would be also indicative that he fired a weapon, right?
Is one of the possibilities, yes.
Okay. And again, the other ones are that he touched a surface that had gunshot residue,
Yes.
and the other one is that he was within very close proximity to somebody that fired a weapon.
Correct.
Okay. And again, we have none of the gunshot residue on any of the clothes.
Right, and there's no patterns as well.
No patterns. All right. How about if I told you that there was gunshot primer residue on the liner of the interior of the vehicle? And by headliner, I mean the roof of the car.
Okay.
Once again, the facts that we know are you found no gunshot residue on any of the clothes and no pattern.
Right.
And that again is indicative of intermediary source or 5 feet or more.
Right.
If I'm shooting a firearm in a car, I'm sitting down, could you estimate about how high is the roof of that car if you're sitting in the driver's seat?
Maybe 6 inches or so.
Okay. So if you're sitting in that car and you fire a shot out, okay, and highly likely you're going to get gunshot primer residue on your hand, right?
Yes.
Okay. And real likely you're going to deposit gunshot primer residue on the headliner of the car, right?
We're talking about, we're shooting the gun inside the car?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Probably the surfaces inside the vehicle are potentials for gunshot primer residue.
Well, if I hold the gun outside the window and fire it, I can't get gunshot primer residue on the headliner or the fabric on the top of the roof, right?
Not from the discharge of the firearm, no.
No. But if I fire it inside the passenger compartment, then I'm going to get gunshot primer residue on the headliner or roof of the car, correct?
Right. If you discharge the firearm inside the vehicle, then there's the potential to have primer residue on surfaces inside the vehicle.
And if we go back to our original knowns, from all the clothing you tested, again, no gunshot residue on any of the surfaces that you tested.
Right, and it's important to understand that when we're dealing with gunshot residue in terms of muzzle to target distance, it's not only the presence or absence of that residue, but it's also a pattern formed by that residue.
And the pattern is where we then can get better on distances.
Right.
But once we have no residue and no pattern, our distance is out there, right?
Right.
Or there was an intermediary source.
Correct.
Okay. So once again, dealing with the known that you have no gunshot residue on the clothes,
Yes.
and you looked at that with your eyeballs and your tests,
Low power magnification.
low power magnification.
Low power magnification.
So you have no gunshot residue on the clothes.
Right.
We've, I think, done this too many times. That means it's distant or an intermediary source prevented it from coming in.
That's correct.
Then
Well,
if we,
you keep on saying intermediary source, as if it's a source of something. It's just an intermediary, something blocking.
An intermediate object.
intermediate, I apologize, instead of source object, okay. All right. So the gunshot residue, primer residue on the headliner isn't going to come from a shot 5 feet away.
Right.
Right. And the gunshot primer residue on the headliner isn't going to come from a shot that went through an intermediary object.
Correct, unless that object is compromised. Then
Okay.
that's the problem.
But if that object were compromised, then we would expect to see the gunshot residue on the clothes.
Not necessarily, because now we're dealing with, if we think about, like in this situation, if we're looking at the windshield as a compromised intermediate object, we have a bunch of very small holes. So if a weapon is then discharged at that object, some residue can potentially get through that small hole, but it's not going to be enough residue to form a pattern. So if it's even deposited somewhere on the clothing, it's not going to be a pattern. It's not going to be any information that I could use to do muzzle to target distance.
But again, I'm talking about gunshot primer residue on the inside headliner roof of the car.
Right.
Okay. You'd agree with me that that is certainly much more consistent based upon all the things you found in that case with a weapon having been discharged inside the passenger compartment of the car than anything else.
More likely than not, I don't know. It's definitely one of the possibilities that would explain why it was there.
Okay. And that possibility, in conjunction with the fact that Mr. Russell had gunshot primer residue on his hand, that would be indicative of as well that he did that, right?
That he fired a weapon?
Yeah, inside the compartment.
It's one of the possibilities.
Okay. And if I told you that the headliner in both the front and the rear of the car had gunshot primer residue? Okay?
Okay.
Does that change any of the analysis we just had? It's not going to go any farther unless the firearm is closer, right?
This is a difficult question.
If you can't answer it, you can't answer it. I mean, that's okay.
I can't answer it, and this is the reason I can't answer it, because there's a history of the vehicle that I don't know.
Okay.
And that's why I can't answer the question.
You don't know what that vehicle did an hour before this incident.
Right, or who was in it a day before, what was done 2 weeks ago. That,
So I guess to be fair, all I can do is you can tell me that you did all the testing that you do there at the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office and that you found no gunshot residue on any of the clothes of Russell and Williams.
that's correct.
And you can tell me approximate distances that exist within your scientific expertise.
Yes.
And I can include variables that BCI found gunshot primer residue on Mr. Russell's hand and on the headliner in the front and back of the car, right?
Okay.
And we've done that back and forth, right?
Yes.
And then we end up with a whole lot of possibilities.
Yes.
There came a time when you participated in a reconstruction, is that correct? Well, maybe you didn't participate, you observed?
Yeah, I prefer to call it a reenactment.
A reenactment, I'm sorry. Okay. There came a time when there was a reenactment back out at Heritage Middle School, correct?
Yes,
And cars were brought back out?
they were.
Well, let me back up for one moment. When you did your investigation of this matter, did you use trajectory rods in this case?
I did not.
You didn't feel that this was an appropriate case where you could use them to any degree of scientific certainty?
And in your question, do you mean on the clothing of the individual or on the
Clothing
vehicle?
or the bodies? Just at all?
But we don't typically use projection rods on the clothing.
Okay. There came a time when there was a, what do you want to call it?
Reenactment?
Reenactment. And were you a participant in that, or did you observe it?
We were asked by the prosecutor's office to produce a set of mannequins that detailed the bullet paths through the bodies of the two individuals, and then we were going to place those mannequins in the vehicle and then observe what was able to be observed from that.
Okay. The Cobb County Medical Examiner's Office hadn't done that previously when they did their investigation of this matter,
No,
back in 2012.
no, there had been no probing of
Does
mannequins.
the Cobb County,
No probing of mannequins?
does the Cobb County Medical Examiner's Office use mannequins?
On occasion, yes.
Now, when you went back out to do this reenactment, it was your belief and understanding that these mannequins would be nothing more than a demonstrative aid, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. There was nothing in your expertise, your training, that would suggest that these mannequins and trajectory rods would accurately portray, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, the actual paths.
I wasn't going to make any conclusions based on the probed mannequins and the mannequins placed in the vehicle, no.
And again, it would be the position of the Cobb County Medical Examiner's Office that may be a illustrative or helpful demonstrative aid, but it didn't hold scientific value.
Their value was in showing the pass of the bullet through the body, then extended out from the body.
Okay. But demonstratively,
Exactly, yes.
not as evidence.
What other agencies wanted to do with them, they can do. But
That was your view.
in terms of our agency, we produced these as demonstrative exhibits and then placed them in the vehicle to see what it looked like.
And there were limitations with these mannequins, correct?
Yes,
And they included that they didn't accurately reflect the size and weight of the people.
that's correct.
Okay, so they weren't to scale, if you will.
Of the victims, that's correct, yes.
Correct. I mean, they were just average mannequins that you said, this one's a man, this one's a woman, and the man's a little bit bigger than the woman, and let's set them in a car, right?
Right, they're actually both female mannequins that we used, two exactly the same mannequins.
And again, they don't accurately reflect the body composition of the victims.
Right, nor height or weight.
No, nor height or weight, or I suppose we all...
Mass, I guess, would be a better
Mass.
description.
I was going to say we all come in different shapes and sizes.
Yes,
Somebody might have the same height, the same weight, but they have a completely different physique, right?
yes,
You could be, say, 6 foot, 195 pounds, and be chiseled, or you could be 6 foot, 195 pounds, and a little chubby, right?
sure.
Okay. And none of that was taken in account when these mannequins were placed there.
No, I'm not totally sure it's you can take that into account. I don't think you can get custom-made mannequins.
Okay. And that, I guess that's what I'm getting at. You can't get a custom-made mannequin. You can't reenact this to such a degree that it would be anything other than a demonstrative tool.
Right, given the mannequin's limitations in terms of height and mass and bendability.
And the mannequin has limitations in that they're not as pliable as the human being, right?
Right.
Okay, they're kind of stiff.
Yeah, they don't articulate nearly as well as a human body does.
So, in essence, when you participated in that or observed it, again, it's your view as part of the county medical examiner's office that those are a demonstrative aid, but they can't clearly or scientifically reenact the actual bodies.
Right. I won't make any conclusions based on.
Okay. You wouldn't make conclusions based on it.
Right.
You wouldn't make trajectory or scientific conclusions based upon what happened to those mannequins.
I think the trajectories into the body are as accurate as they can be given the mannequins, but I wouldn't make any conclusions that somehow these mannequins placed in the vehicle suggest one position over another.
Okay. And I think we discussed whether or not the fact that the windshield had been left out in the snow and had lost its integrity or caved in, for lack of a better term, that didn't impact your decision on that at all, did it?
No.
Okay, so whether the windshield was intact or not would not have changed your opinion on the usefulness or value of the mannequins?
As far as I was concerned, no.
Okay. Can I have a moment, Chief?
Sure. Excuse me.
As always, thank you, sir.
Gunshot, primer, residue, lead, barium, and antimony can come out of any direction,
Right.
including the barrel.
It can come out of the end of the barrel of the weapon, but gunshot primer residue as a type of gunshot residue is not useful in determining distance, muzzle to target distance.
Understood. Following nitrites or unburned gunpowder only come out of the barrel.
Some what would be fouling would escape through some gaps in the weapon, but in terms of producing patterns that are indicative of muzzle to target distance, we're basically interested in the residue that's expelled from the end of the barrel.
There is, as I understand it, expected to be evidence in this case that a handgun was shot into the passenger compartment of that vehicle from around the hood of the vehicle. I can't estimate the distance. 1, 2, 4, 6 feet away. Have you been made aware of that?
Roundabout, yes.
Assuming that that is true, and assuming that the proposition that there was gunshot primer residue on the headliner of the passenger compartment is also true, would you expect then that that gunshot primer residue came through a hole in the windshield, even though you found no fouling, nitrites, or unburned gunpowder on the clothing?
That could be a possibility, yes.
Yeah, under what circumstance?
It would have to be that once the intermediate object, being the windshield, was compromised, that some primer residue could then penetrate into the interior of the vehicle. And at that point, once this residue could then penetrate into the interior of the vehicle, that interior of the vehicle then becomes... The interior of that vehicle then becomes contaminated, not contaminated in a bad way, but then there's primer residue in the interior of the vehicle that's subject to deposition on surfaces, that's subject to secondary transfer onto other surfaces. So included in the possibilities that could explain why there's residue in the interior of the vehicle, the possibility that some had penetrated through compromised portions of the intermediate object could explain why there is residue in the vehicle, as well as other possibilities such as the discharge of a weapon inside the vehicle.
Would gunshot primer residue, the three elements, and fouling, nitrites, or unburned gunpowder, typically that which comes out of the barrel go in the same direction and deposit on the same surfaces?
Yes, like if you were to test fire a weapon at known distances, say like 6 inches, 1 foot, 1.5 feet, 2 feet, and then you looked at those test fire targets, you would then potentially have the possibility of having all of those residues present on that target, fouling, if it was close enough, nitrites, powder grains, as well as gunshot primer residue, which we wouldn't test for. It wouldn't help us in most of the target distance, but it would be there.
Okay. And then one final thing. I don't know what the evidence is going to show, but assuming there is evidence that there's gunshot primer residue on this car's headliner, and making an educated guess about what that headliner was made of, which is to say vinyl, I would imagine, but of course I can't be sure. Let's assume those two things are accurate. How long, here's my question, how long would you expect gunshot primer residue to persist on a vinyl surface or a surface similar to an ordinary headliner?
In terms of primer residue, it's not, over time, it's not going to change into something else. It's going to stay whatever it's composed of, the 3 elements, the 2 elements. It's going to remain on a surface until it's removed from that surface.
Okay, so it'll stay there until it's washed or cleaned.
Right.
Which, and here's what I'm getting at, it shouldn't be a secret. If at some point a gun was fired in that car a day earlier, a week earlier, a year earlier, and the headliner hadn't been washed, would you imagine you would still find, well, this hypothetical should include the following. When that gun was fired in the car, lead, barium, antimony, or 2 out of 3 of them were deposited on the headliner. If that occurred a week earlier, a year earlier, a decade earlier, and the headliner had never been washed, cleaned, otherwise molested, would you assume, it's a wrong word, adulterated, would you assume that the elements would still be there?
Yes, and that speaks to what I talked about, the unknown history of the vehicle prior to the shooting event.
Right. All right, I thank you for answering my questions. I appreciate your indulgence. Ms. Royster, do you have any redirect based upon what has been asked since we last inquired?
I have no redirect, Your Honor.
I asked some questions. Do you have any recross based on those, Mr. Shaughnessy?
No, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir, I appreciate you coming down here 2 days in a row. Your excuse at this point.
Thanks.
Who's your next witness, Mr. Gutierrez?
The forensic mechanic, Your Honor.
Okay. Any chance of getting him done in, it's a he, right? Getting him done in 40 minutes?
We can give it a shot.
Okay.
I don't anticipate he's going to be prolonged, let's put it that way. I would imagine it would
Okay.
probably take 40 minutes. I'd say 40 minutes to an hour. That's my guess.
Okay. I would like to break a quarter till. If he's real close to being done, we'll go for a few more minutes. But just FYI, so you know what the schedule is.
Very good, Judge. And he is available to return after lunch.
Okay.
Thank you.
Did you promise him lunch? Or are you buying him lunch? If he
I am
has
not
it?
buying him lunch.
Maybe we should get him done. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear you testify to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Watch that stare. Kindly have a seat there.
Thank you.
And if you would please speak to the microphone, I'd appreciate it. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You're welcome.
Your Honor, may I have just one more minute to this?
Sure.
right, sir. Could you please state your name for the record and spell your name?
Yes, it's Lynn, and my full name is H. Lynn, Lyn Smith, Smith.
And Mr. Smith, what do you do for a living?
I investigate mechanical explanations to accident events.
And can you tell us a little bit about your history, background, education, and general experience in mechanics, please?
Sure. In fact, Saturday was 47 years in business. I have had mechanical shops and machine shops since 1968. During that time, I've also taught mechanical classes. I have designed training curriculums. During that time, since the mid-70s, I've been certified as a master automotive, medium, and heavy-duty truck technician. Been involved in motorsports for most of that time.
And sir, do you have any certifications or degrees, training, anything like that?
The one that exists that we have in our field is the NIASE certifications that I mentioned.
And what does NIASE stand for?
National Institute for Automotive Service Excellence.
And where are you? You said you teach, correct?
I teach part-time, yes.
Where do you teach?
I have taught at Akron U, Stark State. I do programming with area schools.
And have you had any occasion to teach or be involved with law enforcement?
I have. I've had classes that were certified for your CLE requirements. I have been involved with local law enforcement down in the greater Akron area with citizens police academies. I've done short courses for police departments.
And have you worked with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, commonly known as BCI?
I have.
And were you called in December of 2012 to examine a 1979 Chevrolet Malibu?
I was.
And can you tell us about that, please?
Yes, I was contacted by Special Agent Mark Kohler and asked if he had kind of outlined some of the questions that existed around this car. We then met, talked about both my credentials and tried to outline a procedure that we could address some of the concerns, and then subsequently did that investigation.
And what was the problem or questions that were posed to you initially when it was determined that you were going to be examining this Malibu?
Two. One, that a question had been raised whether this car may have backfired. And the second part that evolved was might there be a way to determine the height of the windows, if they were up or down on the driver and passenger door.
Very good. Now, let's first address backfiring in general. I'm assuming that's something you're familiar with over the course of your 47-year career, correct?
Yes.
Can you explain to us generally what a backfire is and when it may arise?
Sure. It is a term associated with unburned fuel, usually gasoline, that gets into the exhaust system unburned.
And we're talking about the exhaust system of a car engine, correct?
A car, or could be just about anything, but the unburned fuel gets into the exhaust side unburned, and some other source then ignites it, and it goes off with a kind of a loud report that we've generally termed backfiring.
Now, generally, how how is a backfire different from how gasoline or fuel is supposed to be processed in the engine? What makes that different between a normal operation and a backfire?
And you outlined it reasonably well. The fuel's supposed to burn in the engine, and we deal with the exhaust system getting the hot gases out usually the back end of the car, and we run it through a device, a muffler for silencing to keep the noise down. And so generally it is direction of exhaust away from the engine in the car, and then quieted through a muffling system.
Now, is it fair to say backfires were more common in the past than they are today?
Very fair, yes.
And when did that change? What is it that makes it less common today?
For some of us with gray hair, most of cars during that time, the fuel was mixed through a device called a carburetor. As good old EPA got involved to help us out and make cars cleaner, they put some constraints on the design of the car that made technology that was kind of expensive in the old days necessary. And so about 85, there was generally thought of as the transition time, about 30 years ago. There were a couple examples of some cars that used carburetors into the early 90s, but they were very limited. One thing we noticed was that cars that had carbureted engines were much more likely to backfire just because of the way it worked. Once they made the transition to fuel injection, specifically electronic fuel injection in the mid-'80s, there's people that's probably never heard cars backfire just because of the way it works and the way it's controlled.
And what is it about the carbureted engine that makes it more prone to backfiring?
It's the way it meters fuel and controls it. The contrast being fuel injection, when you get off the throttle, if you would, the electronic systems that control it shut the fuel off instantly. It both keeps emissions down so the cars are cleaner, but it kind of eliminates that process we talked about earlier where we needed unburned fuel to get into the exhaust system to give a source of this backfire when it exploded. Carburetors didn't have that advantage. When you decelerated, it would just suck extra fuel out of the carburetor through the engine and could provide this unburned fuel in the exhaust system.
And so what are conditions, if you were to attempt to create a backfire, for example, in a carbureted car, what would you do to create that backfire? What conditions would create that?
And I have a waiver, I hope, from you guys that if I confess to actually doing this as a young'un, you're not going to take me to jail.
I think the statute of limitations is passed, but go on. So when you were a kid, well, let me back up. You liked cars as a kid?
Didn't everybody?
All right. You yourself had cars backfire, correct?
Well, we made them backfire
All right.
because it was just too much fun not to.
That was going to be my question. Is it something you have been able to do intentionally?
Certainly.
With older cars. All right. Tell us how that would happen then.
If one would be going down the road in gear and turn the ignition switch off, no longer is the engine burning fuel, it is pumping it into the exhaust. If one, as they went by a group of somebody they wanted to attract attention from, and turned the key back on, we suddenly would have an ignition source. There would usually be a loud bang. There was great fun watching them jump, and until sometimes our parents found out that the reason the muffler exploded too was because of this great fun. there was consequences, but that was one way to do it.
Are there other ways, I mean, short of, I'm assuming not every backfire is caused by someone intentionally turning the ignition off, correct?
No.
All right.
Often it's a mechanical problem with the engine. If we have misfires, and generally we use that term, firing, because an engine sucks in air and fuel, a spark plug controlled by the ignition system sparks at the right time and explodes the air and fuel to make power. If those systems are faulty, if spark plugs are bad, if carburetors are not mixing the fuel correctly, if other components if they are degraded to the point that the engine doesn't burn all the fuel in the engine, it allows the condition to move some of that fuel into the exhaust. Once it's there, you have the potential to backfire.
And if a car has backfired, is that something you are able to tell as a forensic mechanic?
Sometimes.
And what are things that you would look for?
Well, things we'd look for, often because it is an explosion, we sometimes see the muffler ballooned out from an internal, the internal pressure. Sometimes pipes have been pushed apart, but there are a few indicators that might exist that makes it more likely than not an engine or a car's backfire.
And when a car backfires, you said there is what you described as a report. How loud are we talking?
It can be very loud. It's a loud bang, and often it's echoed, depending on where it happens. If it's in the muffler area, sometimes it echoes under the car, between the road, the area where the muffler sits, or the tailpipe. And it can be quite loud. It gets your attention.
And is there, do you see anything? If someone is standing next to a car that is backfiring or that backfires and is observing the car, is there anything you can see that accompanies the sound?
It depends, and it isn't always a cause and effect. But sometimes with certain exhaust systems, you could see some flame come out.
And where would the flame come out?
The tailpipe.
Very good. And is there anything in the tailpipe that you would particularly look for in determining whether a vehicle had backfired or was prone to backfiring?
Things a mechanic would look at, generally when there is too much fuel matched to the air that either the fuel injection or the carburetor is mixing. If it is, we say it's running rich when there's way too much fuel for the air and oxygen to burn it. So generally we see sooting and black material in the tailpipe when it's running rich, and this is on the side of what would cause a backfire, make it more likely. If it's on the other side, not enough gasoline or too much air, the pipe gets remarkably clean. Sometimes they almost look white. So we would look for a black sooty condition on a tailpipe.
Right. And these things that you have talked about that you would look for in a backfiring engine, is that consistent with the examination you conducted on the Malibu in December of 2012?
That and other things.
What else did you do to the Malibu?
We looked for just the obvious. If you would, we almost made a flow chart. What things might we observe or conditions we might find that would be on the side of the chart that would say, these need to be there to make a car backfire. There was also kind of the list of evidence that one would expect to find if it had backfired. So some of the things we looked at was the condition of the engine itself, and the way it turned out, the way the spark plug wires were routed, we looked at and took the distributor cap off that's part of the ignition system to see if there were conditions consistent with making an engine run rough, misfire, or backfire. And then I'd also brought up, the category, they're called engine analyzers, but they're oscilloscopes. They look like EKG machines hooked to an engine. We can watch it take readings and show results of the ignition system and spark plugs working in real time. And so that was hooked up to this car.
And that was the examination you did, is that correct?
Yes,
And did you produce a report based on that examination?
I did.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Of course.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Smith, handing you what's been marked for identification purposes as State's Exhibit 103, I'd just ask you to take a look through that.
That's the report I had sent to Special Agent Sweet.
Very good. I'm going to let you hold on to that.
I will.
And that's the report based on your findings in December of 2012, correct?
That's correct.
Did you also take photographs when you were out at BCI?
I did.
And what was the purpose of those photographs?
My memory might not be good, so I took photographs just to memorialize what we were looking at.
Basically to document what you did. Is that fair to say?
Yes, yes ma'am.
And sir, I'm handing you what's been marked for identification purposes as State's Exhibits 106 through 123. I just ask you to flip through those and look up when you've had a chance to review them.
Yes, these are the photographs. I'm not sure if they're all of them, but these were taken by me.
And those you took as part of your inspection, correct?
Yes.
And those are fair and accurate copies of the photographs you took that day?
They look fine.
Very good. So turning our attention... turning your attention, sir, starting with State's Exhibit 106.
Yes.
Can you describe to the court what we're looking at here in State's 106?
This is the engine compartment of the vehicle we inspected.
And this is just an overall shot, correct?
Yes.
All right. Turning our attention to State's 107. What are we looking at here in State's 107?
This is the left side of the engine compartment, and the thing of significance is the way the spark plug wires are routed.
And, Your Honor, may I have the witness step down?
Of course.
Thank you. Sorry, I just asked you to step down here. I'm going to give you a pointer. I'm going to place you over here and ask that you not actually touch the screen because it's a touch screen. But if you could point out for the judge what your, first of all, where the spark plug wires are and explain why they are of interest.
All right. Is this all right?
Yes.
Position. These we see a group, and at this point we can see 4. This is a V8 engine, 4 spark plugs on each side, left side. These are spark plug wires that have been replaced. In fact, this one you can see all the way down to where it goes on the spark plug. When General Motors made the engine, they had looms. In fact, up here you can see a couple of them that put the wires in a really neat and orderly fashion. They're a real nuisance to string them if you replace them, and often people kind of take the easy way out, and these have been replaced at least once, probably other times in its life, but they routed them outside the loom area.
And did you draw any conclusions about whether or not this would, whether this would contribute or not contribute to a backfire potential in this car?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
And it would. It's kind of auto mechanics 101. We keep the wires separated because current going down one wire can induce a current in the wire close to it. So the further apart we can keep them, the better, because crossfiring can cause backfire. And these have been even, they're bundling ties, they're held together so close that even if the wires were brand new, this would cause an engine to run rough and inconsistent just because it's just poor procedures.
Very good. Moving on to State's Exhibit 108. What are we looking at here in 108?
This is just a view of, that's the distributor cap. This is behind the carburetor in this neck of the woods. And it's just a general view of where the distributor lies. These are some of the connections that when you turn a key on, they become active. And we can see some of the spark plug wires taking off the alley west from the distributor cap.
And just for orientation purposes, and again, I just asked you to stay over the side here, is where are we oriented within the vehicle? So for example, where is the windshield, where is the front of the car?
This is a view over the left front fender. Windshield is in this neck of the woods. In fact, this is the disconnected windshield washer nozzles. This would be the center of the engine compartment, again viewed from the left side. So we're about midway down the engine compartment viewed from the left side of the car.
Moving on to State's 109. What are we looking at here in 109?
Again, a general shot of the engine compartment viewed from the left front corner. I've removed the air filter canister cover. Again, we can see the spark plug wires. This is just a view of the top of the carburetor when the cover's off.
State's 110.
I've removed the whole canister, and you can see the carburetor sitting here, the distributor here, fuel lines, spark plug wires, and just kind of a view of general condition of the thing.
That's not working. All right. That's okay. State's 111.
Yes, this is under the car. We've raised it, and the significance of this. If this makes sense, I'm standing kind of center line under the car, looking forward. The front end of the wheels would be up here. This gizmo is in the old days. This car had a catalytic converter of one of the first designs. That's a thing, it's for emission controls, but it also acts as a big container, not just like a muffler, but it would really suppress pressure waves if a car backfired. But they were expensive. And somebody in its life, and not the greatest technician in the world, that pipe was used to replace it after the catalytic converter was removed. And it turns out it didn't even fit very well. It's pretty loose, as one can see in these areas.
And those two conditions, the removal of the catalytic converter and the loose-fitting exhaust pipe, were you able to reach a conclusion as to whether that was a condition that made the car more or less likely prone to backfire?
These are contributing pieces that add to the list. Is this a vehicle that should or would backfire? And it is, because it's not only loose, we have exhaust leaks going out. It's a source for air to get back in, and you need the oxygen in the air to explode the gas. If it misfires, it gets down in the system.
All right, moving on to States 112.
Another view, and part of it was, you see the relationship to the front tires. This is the left front here. But that's they used to call them test pipes to get rid of the converter. But, and they had to make a number of joints. All these joints were loose. And this also, we were looking at kind of the general condition of the vehicle, the amount of degradation of the frame, cross member. These are brake and fuel lines running over on the other side of the car that were in pretty bad shape.
Very good. States Exhibit 113.
Overkill, but another picture of a loose connection in the exhaust system. This would make the exhaust loud and be that source both in and out for air.
Very good. States Exhibit 114.
We move to the rear of the car. I'm standing under the left rear tire. This is the axle housing. That's the right rear tire. And this had a transverse mounted muffler. It mounted parallel to the differential. And again, wired up. But the thing that was of more interest to me was down at this corner.
And I'll move on to States 115. There we go.
Bingo.
What are we looking at in States 115?
This is the corner of the thing that I said I thought was interesting. And again, signs of general condition and deterioration. But this corner, besides this area rusting out, things that are kind of interesting to a mechanic, see how black it is inside. This thing's been running very rich, which means extra gasoline, more than was being burned in the engine. And then the way this piece looks like, it looks like it has moved outward from an internal pressure. And so the rich run condition, the look that this has been pushed out, would have been on the list of, this is more likely than not that this car's backfired.
So in your expert opinion, is this hole in the muffler here caused by a backfire?
It's part of two things.
Okay.
Degradation from just rusting, and then a pressure pulse, or a few of them, that push the metal outward.
But you weren't able to tell when that particular hole in the muffler occurred, correct?
No. Unlike newer cars that actually have event data recorders that computers monitor things, this didn't even come close to that. So it is kind of the sum total of evidence, but you don't know when it happened.
Very good. States Exhibit 116.
Again, a different view of the deterioration at that corner of the muffler. We're still looking that way. Right rear tire, but the frame has rusted and actually broken behind the housing. The car was in bad shape.
117.
Yes.
What are we looking at here?
That's the tailpipe, and as we talked earlier, the idea of the amount of soot, how black it is the telltale evidence that it's been running very rich. Again, rich, excess fuel, not enough air to burn it, so it's a rich run condition.
And is this, again, something that you would, were you able to form an opinion about whether or not this would be on a car prone to backfire?
It would.
This is consistent with a backfiring car?
It is.
Very good. States 118?
This is just center, kind of standing under the tail shaft of the transmission that's in the center frame, looking forward. In that test pipe, or the pipe that replaced the converter, is exposed there. Again, a shot of the deterioration of the car, and it's been a leaker, and but just a different view of the catalytic converter missing.
Very good. And I think in earlier you testified about an oscilloscope, is that correct?
Close. Oscilloscope.
Right. There we go.
Sound British.
In States Exhibit 119, is that what we are looking at?
Yes.
And what is the purpose of that?
I can hook it up to the ignition system, and we can watch it work in real time. And the patterns it makes give a tech a way to assess what they're looking at. Certain patterns mean certain things.
And did you learn anything from hooking this device up and running the Malibu?
Yes.
And what was it that you learned?
A few things. One, somebody had, and we also confirmed it by going and looking, the distributor cap was pretty new. It had been replaced much sooner than most of the other stuff on this, maybe 6 months, 9 months. The other thing, looking at the patterns, we can look at all 8 spark plugs firing in order. And the voltage it takes tells you whether the mixture, this air and fuel ratio, is in the ballpark. It was consistent with a rich run vehicle. And within that, we're able to, if you think about an 8-cylinder engine is really 8 one-cylinder engines tied together. So you could kind of logically say, if I could shut them off, the engine should slow up the same amount if they're each doing the same amount of work. In doing what's called a cylinder balance test, we found that 3 of the cylinders were doing just about nothing. And this again moves to on the side of when they misfire, if they're not firing, that allows those fuel loads to go into the exhaust. And given certain conditions, it would be on the list of more likely than not to backfire.
Very good. And turning our attention to States Exhibit 120, I believe you mentioned the distributor cap. Is that what we're looking at here?
Yeah, this is part of the hookup for the oscilloscope. This is called the secondary pickup, and this is a primary pickup. But here is the cap. It's kind of dirty, but when we took it off to look in it, because we saw some signs in the patterns that something was going on in there, this is what we removed. This could lift off and allow us to see the innards of it.
Very good. And States Exhibit 121.
The innards, that is the distributor cap, and it looks in good shape. Things you'll look for is degradation again on these terminals. Each one of these match up with one of the spark plug wires. This is the high voltage output that goes to a thing called a rotor. And the engine's running, it's just spinning inside this distributor cap, and it would direct the spark to the appropriate cylinder.
Very good. You can resume your seat. Thank you very much.
You want this back?
Yes, thank you. So based on all of those tests, were you able to draw any conclusions about the car and its propensity for backfiring?
Yes.
And what was that conclusion?
That if you were going to build a car that was going to backfire, this would be the poster child.
Now, I believe you also testified that you were attempting to find out the height of windows. Is
Yes.
that correct? Can you tell us about that, please? How did you attempt to find the height of the windows of the car?
And just in case with the photograph, that was the, that thing you had was a coffin nail for backfiring.
Which?
That rotor, that white piece that you had in the frame just before that.
Hold on just a moment.
Bingo.
States Exhibit 123.
Yes. What I hopefully was explaining half well, that is the rotor that sits inside the distributor cap. And you can kind of see a finger. There's a center recess and then a strip that moves outward. That spins as long as the engine's spinning, directing spark from the center terminal out. And if you look dead in the center, that is really black. That is degradation of the rotor. And rotors in, these things are called HEI ignition systems, is the #1 selling part. That thing is the thing that fails most often. And when it does, sometimes it won't start at all. But this one is in extremely bad condition. And I believe there might be a photograph of the underside. But if not, that center terminal deteriorates to the point that the spark can actually go through it to the metal shaft underneath. And that's just a different way of that kid turning off the key.
Very good. So this would cut power.
And that would cut power, let fuel go into the exhaust.
Now, like I said, turning our attention back to finding the approximate height of the windows of the vehicle. Now, when we're talking about approximate height, we're talking about how far the window was rolled down. Is that fair to say?
Up or down.
Okay. Were you able to determine that?
Yes.
And what procedure did you use to make that determination?
Well, when we looked at the car, when we first set it up, we found out this thing had electric windows. And with power off, though the glass was gone, we could look down and it was fixed. Nobody could have cranked it up and down. You know, it was sitting there. And I was able to find the specifications, the dimensions of the side glass for this car. So what we did was just put a tape measure down to it's called the regulator. It's the thing that the window glass sets in. Measured up, I think it was 19 inches was the dimension. And then you probably saw in one of the photographs, the team was kind of assisting, putting a straight edge, that dimension up, which would give a visual of how high the window was.
Very good. So how did the window raising and lowering mechanism in this car work?
Luckily it didn't, because it had been affected by, we assume, the event. The glass was out of it. But since there wasn't a crank per se, it was wherever it was.
What does the window glass sit in, or how is the window glass situated to be raised and lowered through the door?
It sits in a mechanism inside the door that we call the regulator. If you have manual windows, you move a crank to raise or lower it. If they're power windows, there's an electric motor that's controlled by a switch. This had electric, it was sitting there like it was, and then we just measured off that channel.
So you were able to find the height of the regulator and then determine, based on the size of the glass, how far up or down that window would have been. Is that correct?
Without putting too fine a point on the regulator, it gave us what we needed. It was just sitting there. The trouble, we weren't sure we were going to be able to find the original dimensions of the glass.
And where did you find that?
I actually confirmed it two ways. One, a glass shop had some old catalogs, and they actually had a drawing of the glass with the dimension.
And what was the second way? You said you did two ways.
I'm sorry. I checked with, it was two sources. I had checked with a parts supplier just to see if I could find it doing a search that way. I just wanted to see if the number repeated.
Very good. And actually, I don't think I handed these to you yet. Turning your attention to States Exhibits 104 and 105.
Yes.
Are these the photographs you took depicting your determination of the heights of the window glass?
Yes, yes, they are.
And turning your attention to States Exhibit 104, we're looking at a tape measure here going across the driver's side window. What is that showing?
That is showing the top of where the top of the window would have been if there were glass in it.
So the top of the window would have been along the top of the measuring tape here?
Yes.
And you were able to determine that, again, based on the size and just calculating that?
I know the dimension of the window. We know the regulator is sitting inside the door, so we just measured up from that.
Very good. And Turning your attention to State's Exhibit 105, what are we looking at here in State's Exhibit 105?
Same example, that's just the driver's side, or passenger side. It was up considerably higher, and that was just both giving a visual of where it was and then measuring down from the window opening. That would show how far that window was down.
And once again, in State's Exhibit 105, it is the top of the measuring tape that we are looking at that would be equal to the top of the window?
Top of the glass, yes.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Sure, although you didn't ask the exact measurement. This looks like it was open about 4 inches.
I think so. Can I check my report? I think I had it in there.
Thank you. And then also the driver's side, too.
Left front was down 10.5 inches, the one that was widest or most open. The right front, good eye, was 4 inches.
Thank you.
Well, while you're conferring with your colleagues, Ms. Barney will go off the record. Mr. Shaughnessy, do you expect to have much, if any, for this witness? Or Mr.
Just a couple questions.
Nothing further, Your Honor. Thank you.
Well, hold on, because I think we're off the record.
Oh, sorry.
So, we're back on. And do you have any more questions, Ms. Barney?
No, Your Honor, nothing further.
Mr. DeAngelo.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You're welcome.
Mr. Smith, were you able to tell the last time that this vehicle backfired?
No.
Were you able to tell the number of times that it backfired?
No, sir.
So you could not give us the date or the time that the vehicle backfired nor the number of times?
Beyond my ability.
All right. Thank you. It was a pleasure listening to your testimony.
Well, thank you. That's hardly ever said.
Well, you referred to it as, you said in the latter portion of your testimony, the faulty rotor is like that kid turning off the ignition. Well, that kid is apparently sitting right here today.
It was the start of the beginning of a misspent youth and brings us together today.
You might be free to go. Let me ask Ms. Barnhill, do you have any based upon Mr. DeAngelo's?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Appreciate you coming down.
Thank you very much.
So let's go back on, let's say at 125, please. Thank you. See you then.
Thank you very much. You're free to go.
This is almost it's very nice to meet you. Thank you. Very nice to meet you.
And you need to show me us.
Yeah.